Namaskara and welcome to BIC Talks, a podcast brought to you by Bangalore International Centre, where we present conversations that move, inform, and encourage discourse.
I've largely been in the academic world, and my work was largely in the philosophy of different domains, largely philosophy of the sciences and philosophy of society. I mean, it's transformed into looking at various questions about Indian society, particularly the question of caste and the phenomena of untouchability and so on. So it is within that framework that I was actually defined in a sense for the first many years, maybe a couple of decades. But to me, the question of fiction has always been an integral part of my writing because I think the world of imagination, which is present in your when you do philosophy or academic writing, is also the world of imagination that you need in the world of fiction. And in that sense, I think fiction is, of course, slightly easier in a sense to do. The big problem with academic books, as many of you know, is citation and reading other people's work. The great part of fiction is I don't have to read everybody else's work before I write a book. But there is also a way of making sense of something. So to me, writing fiction was about understanding some phenomena, something around me in a sense. So I mean, for example, my work with Gopal Guru, which has been on, as I said, on the structure of India, caste system in India, was also about trying to understand the nature of social processes in a society. But when both in following a prayer, which is a lot about how to talk about religion in a society, particularly in a society where it's so difficult to talk about religion. How can children get up and say, "I don't believe in God"? What does it actually mean to be able to say that? And so that's a lot about this great existential question which strikes little children, not adults, who ask these questions all the time, of course. And then it's related to the question of language, right? What kind of language do you have to capture your experience with the divine or with questions of transcendence like religion? So to me, this question of language has always been a common interest, and I'm sure we'll talk a little more about it. So I don't want to jump forward to what we might discuss, but just to give you a background. I think that also came back to this question of Water Days. So when I wrote Water Days, it's of course a reflection of a particular time in Bangalore, of a particular place where I grew up, where I lived when I was working at the National Institute of Advanced Studies, right outside National Institute of Advanced Studies. It is a locality called Matikere, which is a very interesting place. Actually, when I moved there, when I lived there for a few years in the 90s, it is so different from what it is today. If any of you have gone to that place, Ramaya College was just coming up. It had not become as big as it is now. And, Ramaya College was actually expanding all the time. And the story was that they were actually taking up all the land of the Indian Institute of Science. So they built a compound at NIAS to actually, put the compound between IIS in outside. And the place was actually, a college which started in a small way, but which attracted a lot of students from Bihar, particularly Bihar, UP, Bihar, a little bit of Bengal. So we were surrounded by students who came from Bihar, who lived there. And, there are such wonderful examples of students I've met who would come from Hindi medium, would have just done Hindi medium till 12th standard, come here, enter directly into an engineering program with English medium. And they would, in the places we rent out, there'll always be small rooms attached to houses. And they would take up a room there and live there. And they would be learning English while trying to do engineering. It's really remarkable, the kind of, spirit they brought into that land. And the whole place has got transformed completely. Just by this kind of, coming in of different people, of different communities, languages, caste, professions, all of them coming and occupying quite a congested place. So it is that place which, resonated so deeply with me, which became a kind of a larger picture of what my own engagement with Bangalore is. Because to me, I belong to Bangalore, and the question of belonging which I want to explore is what does it mean for me to belong to Bangalore? What does it mean for people who come from very different backgrounds and languages and many other kinds of diversity? What does it mean for us to say, this is my city? And so it is that metaphorical position which Matikere gave me. More importantly, it gave me the recognition that change happens so silently, so insidiously, that we don't even know that it is happening. And before we woke up, things had changed so radically. And it's not just with the locality, it's with technologies, which is it's a professional interest of mine to study, the history and philosophy of technology. How much it has entered into our lives in the flash. In just a second, you have moved, you turned your head, and there's a different world when you turn back. And Bangalore has become like that. So it was a way of trying to make sense of it. But why fiction in that sense? That gave me a much greater framework to be able to say and explore certain things, which in a very academic sense would have been far more difficult to do and I think far more boring to do. And the question of water days, and this will be the last point perhaps, so that we're waiting to listen to Stanley. The last point is about the water days thing, and people have said, what is this water days? And, for me, my growing up in Bangalore, I was earlier when we grew up as children, it was in Malleshwaram. And largely, so we've always been in North Bangalore till I moved to South Bangalore now. North Bangalore has always had water problem. My whole childhood, all I remember is picking up water because we're a big family and we were in the first floor. So my brothers and me, all we had to do was to pick up water from the well and keep transporting every day before we go to school. Water was a big problem. Water continues to be a major problem today. And in Matikere, the story which where it's set around, it's this early morning collection of water. And who are the people who go collect water at 3 o'clock and 4 o'clock in the morning? All these silent women who come there, stand under these taps. Sometimes it works, sometimes it won't come. You just stand there, pick up water. Your engagement with the city at 4 in the morning is a completely different engagement. It's a different world of Bangalore that comes alive in front of you. So it is that, with these kinds of sensuous experiences, how can I write a social science book on this? It had to be fiction. It had to be a story. It had to be something which can touch people, where you bring in the notions of an emotional engagement with your stories and the land, rather than just a pure descriptive or a argumentative or an analytical account of it. So I'll stop here and then we can.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I think Sundar has given you all a gist of what the novel is all about. So I won't dwell on that, but our conversation is going to revolve around water days. And we will also dip a little into his first novel, Following a Prayer. Just to give you all a brief about Following a Prayer, that's a nice, enchanting story about, three girls, and it is set in a village in the Western Ghats. And one of these girls goes missing, basically goes missing in search of a prayer. And then the story follows. I wouldn't go more into it. But so that's Following a Prayer. And both the books have common themes. So, it's all about speech, silence, meaning, and more. So we'll dwell on that a little later. But for now, shall we dive straight in? Sundar, you did mention about water days just now, that y'all when y'all were growing up, y'all had to fill water, and there was water shortage and all of that. Now, I thought water days as a title for the book was a bit limiting, because the book is a lot more than water days. Water, and also about it's more than people just gathering at the water taps and having these conversations. It's so much more really about migration, about language, and about multicultural people living together, all of that. So why did you limit the title to Water Days?
Yeah, I think the the image which really caught my attention, and I think the whole story revolves around this potency of water. So for me, water is an agent. It's like human beings. It is water which acts, because it's not we who decide to. It's when you sit waiting for that water taps. That's when the possibility of a story happens only because of that. If I don't know how much of the story we're talking about, but the real dynamic moment in the thing happens when women meet in front of the tap waiting for the water to fill up, and then they ask something of each other. And if it was not for that water, and so a lot of the personal dynamics are actually reflected at the way in water flows out of the tap. Water flows out of the tap slowly, it drips, it comes fast. So everything revolves around this really elemental characteristic of water, right? And I still feel that it captures a very important part of Bangalore. I think many of us who are probably in apartments and stuff have forgotten this. But this idea that water is because just to give you a quick example, I mean, now that I'm in JP Nagar, Jayanagar has not much of a problem. Right near Vega Mall, I'm sure many of you know Vega Mall, Bannerghatta Road, right? And after this book came out, somebody similar said, "Wait, where are the water problem in Bangalore?" I was walking to the mall, and just below the mall, there is a tap outside, and there are people standing outside trying to fill it up in all these plastic bucket, whatever this cordam we call it, right? So they're all standing there waiting to fill water in a place just below where we think there's a lot of water, below a big fancy mall. There's a huge settlement. For them, water of everyday water comes only.
Right. And the cover of the book is very telling, with a tap. And from the tap, you have, these alphabets of different languages flowing out. So that's also a very interesting cover.
If I can just say a little bit about,
Sure.
just a line,
Yeah.
because it's an old childhood friend of mine who also grew up with me in Malleshwaram, who's a filmmaker and who's also an artist, is in Goa. And he also designed Following a Prayer. And he has a motive in his paintings where he has been drawing with alphabets, different forms of alphabets in different languages. So he used that for both these books too.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Sundar, when it comes to genre, Water Days defies classification. You have a murder, there's investigation, and they are trying to seek the truth. So there's a bit of the mystery in it. Then it's about migrants and this multicultural population living in Matikere. So it is about about a general a kind of a city story, right, about migration and all of that. And there is also the story, because it's set in Bangalore and there's so much of Bangalore there. It is also probably a bit of a biography, right? And the whole social fabric of Bangalore changing and all of that. So it could also be read as a social commentary. So, it's really so many things. Could you help us understand, this complex cocktail of a book that you've written?
Okay, that's a nice way of putting what you are basically saying. Is it is one of the most important dish which Bangalore is famous for is bisibele bath, right? You're basically saying there's a bisibele bath of a lot of things put in it. Yeah, I mean bisibele bath. You tell any Kannadiga, self-respecting Kannadiga, they don't like bisibele bath, they'll get really upset, right? So bisibele bath has something. I don't know. I'm not a great fan of it, but I think that idea of combination of collection of things. But I think more than the mix of various kinds of genres in this, I would still say, okay, let me put it this way. The question I had and I still have in all my writing, especially with fiction, is a very simple question. Do I have the language to tell a story? We think, there's a story out in the world. I don't know whatever that is, there is a story out in the world. And if I want to write it, I think, okay, all I have to do is to write that story. So the difficulty of writing then becomes whether I have the language to write that story. To me, the question for me when I write is, do I have the language? By that, I don't mean, do I know English or Kannada to write that story? I'm saying, what is the language of a story? So that really is my preoccupation. So yes, when I begin with this kind of stories of there's an event which happens, a girl dies, and people want to know various things around it. So definitely there's a, if you want to call it a mystery, yes, it is a mystery. And I think this kind of a quest or a something mysterious, something which drives you, is something I think is what gives the narrative pull. You want to know what's happening, you want to read through what it is, right? But to me, the interesting question is, what is it? Do I, just because I think I know I can write a little bit of English, can I, does that, is that language enough to be able to represent that story? And that's why for me, the constant struggle is not what story I can say, but what language I can create in order to be able to tell that story. So that is a kind of a obsession with my writing.
Right. But if you have to classify it under a particular genre, under what would you classify?
Okay, I wrote this because I'm a great fan of detective and spy stories. So I wrote it as a detective story. It is actually a detective story in the sense there is the security guard. It is the time in Bangalore where security agencies were popping up. I remember even as a thing in the MG Road, there's a very big, suddenly there's a big security agency where, and the advertisement for it is exactly what I remember from those days, where it says matters handled discreetly on big board, or discrete matters handled or whatever, around that. So it is okay. So you have this great idea of a thing, and my fascination with murder mysteries and spies are about it's about a nature of human condition. It's not about, so because people often ask, why do people read detective books or murder stories, right? There is something about the human condition which is present in that, something about law, something about justice. They are very central to why I think a lot of people. And there's of course this question of tracking class, solving puzzles and so on. So I began like that. So there is this guy who is a real small time fellow in Matikere who wants to set up a detective agency, but he's a very nice guy. He's a Bangalorean. Okay. Very sweet chap. Yeah, that's all he can do. He can't run, he can't be Hercule Poirot. And the point I was trying to say is that a larger commentary, which is part of it, is that you cannot write a detective story in the Indian context.
Why?
Yeah, that's the point. In other words, why? It's an interesting question. You can't have Hercule Poirot and James Bond in Bangalore. Raghavendra wants to start one. He's got all this aspiration. But then he's got a wife and 2 children. And, we are so, the question of family is, so it's a cultural, commentary on what happens to us as individuals living in a society. With his wife and 2 children, 2 small girls, constantly they are at the forefront of everything around him. He wants to dream of going around and solving problems and being another James Bond, but he can't, poor chap. Because his wife will say, "Have you gone to the market? Go buy the milk and come, and go drop the kid and come." And this struggle of what it is to capture the cultural world of India. This is a question I think which has a resonance with my earlier work. I mean, one of the questions which interested me is, what does it mean to do academics in India? Can you do science in India, which is like a global science? Can we do philosophy in India like it is some kind of a normal global template? And our cultural worlds are different, our social expectations are different. And within that world, how do we produce what we produce?
Right. Let me just butt in here.
Yeah.
Now, Raghavendra didn't become a detective of his own volition. His wife tasked him to investigate the death, right? So, was he really, did he have plans to become or start a detective agency? And secondly, he also had plans to start a grocery, right?
Yeah.
So, how does that play into this?
Okay, so he's working in a security agency, wants to, he thinks he's set up a detective agency, etc., right? But it is about the impossibility of doing that. That's really what I'm exploring. But actually, what Raghavendra really wants to do in his life is something very close to what I want to do in my life, which is set up a grocery store. I don't know why I have a great fascination for grocery stores, because I really envy. I think it's something to do with, it's this kind of a story I've made up about them. That their whole day I'm going to office, I'm going to school, I'm doing all this, and these guys are just sitting in their shop. All they have to do is meet people who come and say, "Oh, hello, how are you? Have some chai," sell a few things. And that really, even today, sometimes I genuinely feel that, just sitting in a shop and looking at the world, engaging with the world is such a wonderful thing to do. So he wants to do only that.
You can, if you have those plans, I would say please go ahead, because one of the greatest writers in India today, Damodar Mauzo, wrote all his stories sitting in his shop. So I think you'll get a lot of stories because you meet a lot of people there.
Very true. But of course, today, the shops have all changed thanks to us online shopping.
Yeah.
All the people whom I knew was very sitting happily, who all used to have, and it actually comes from Matikere also. In Matikere, the roads are small, but there'll be some 5 grocery stores. And it's like shocking. There are only 100 people there, and not all of us can go buy in that. They'll all keep only little bit, 2 kilos rice, half a kilo dal and all. And people will go and say, give me 100 grams tur dal. And this fellow will pour 100 grams and give. And then that time we used to have in paper, no? We'll put it in, roll it in paper, newspaper, and give you 100 grams dal and some little bit of something. So why so many people? And then you had the Reliance and others who came, and the whole grocery world has changed. So that's
another story altogether. Now, your novel has a constellation of characters and quite diverse, right? All the characters are quite diverse. Now, I'm curious to know whether, you began the story with a central thread, or did you collect the voices and then let them speak? How did you get around that?
Yeah, that's a tough. I think the book is a collection of a lot of images. What triggered the book were a lot of images and sounds. I think a lot of my writing has to do with the sensorial world. And that's why language to me is a sensorium. I listen to language not to look at what its meanings are, what its grammar is, but how does it sound, right? So one of the things I had heard, one of the triggers of the book when I was living there, and this was written much later, of course, but when I was living there, somebody in my locality said, "Oh, did you hear one girl died in our road somewhere?" None of us knew that house, none of us knew who that girl was. It didn't matter. And that's the way this story actually begins, because there is a rumor of that. And then it's a young girl, a teenager, right? And Raghavendra's wife gets to hear from everybody. She goes to a shop to buy something. That boy will tell her why that girl died. She goes to buy milk. That woman tells her, "Oh, this is what happened, that girl died." And there's a whole, that's the way these communities live. It is not that we are very close. It is unlike, like, say, in very modern city states where, for example, the very common things when we all are with friends and others, we'll say, "Oh, come home for dinner," and there's a Friday night, people will meet up and stuff like that. In many of these places, these families are not going and meeting them on Friday night for dinner. They don't go as family and go and sit there. The ways in which people relate in these places are so different. And it is that was a trigger.
Oh, okay.
And then this image of that collecting water early morning, and those plastic buckets, and people standing in queue, people waiting to pick up water and take it home.
Right.
It is built around those kinds of images. And then I think it had a life of its own.
Okay, interesting. I just want to probe a little into the mystery element, because they form an important part of both your books, right? And we happened to discuss your book at our book club meeting, and some of them felt that you must have initially begun this as a mystery detective kind of a whodunit novel, and then suddenly, changed it into language, and the focus shifted. So was it a challenge? Is that correct? Or was it a challenge to make it a complete mystery novel?
Yeah, I mean, that's interesting that you say this. The whole point of my writing this was to say why it is impossible to write a mystery novel in the way we think a mystery novel should be written. That's the point. I'm saying a mystery set in the Indian context in localities like this, places like this, have a cultural resonance, have a cultural description that does not allow you to reproduce an Agatha Christie. That's my claim. So, yes, I'm pushing at the boundaries of what we mean by genres of writing and saying, by the way, this what I'm doing is not new, because some of the most interesting detective novels after the early period of Sherlock Holmes and Agatha Christie and so on, there have been so many interesting detective stories where the detectives are always people with various kinds of problems. I mean, today it's impossible to watch a serial, a detective serial, a police serial, for example, where the detective or the person who is doing the police thing does not carry various scars of a family. For example, you'll have a detective who's doing something and he'll have a very troubled relationship with his daughter. I mean, for example, Bosch is a very good example of a wonderful series where you know the detectives themselves, the people who stand for right and justice, are often seen as being weakened by various kinds of personal relations. That's become a trope now, almost all. Right. So for me, it is in that trope that I'm working. Okay. Yeah. So you, in other words, what they were doing was to saying that, look, the days of the hero detective is not possible. What you need are to accept the fact that being somebody who wants to fight for justice and right and wrong in the world has to engage the day-to-day life of that world and how that transforms them in their own work.
Interesting. Okay, so let's move on to the language aspect of the book, because this whole aspect of language is almost like a character in the book. I don't know if I'm right to assume that, but I felt, because there's so much of emphasis on that, right? This whole thing about what is the language of the city, and which is how many, when there are, especially in when there are so many languages spoken. Now also you say, I'll just read out a little bit here. The language of a city is not another human language that we can speak. It may have a relation to it, but it is not that in its entirety. So can you just elaborate on this whole language thing, Sundar?
Yeah. Okay, so I'm going back to a very simple question, right? And it's true of writing anything, whether it's an essay or it's my academic work or whatever. When I write about something, I'm using language to say something, whatever it is. I may be representing something, I'm trying to describe the world, or I'm imagining something, whatever else it is, right? And we are given a particular language to work with. And the people who regulate that language for the most part, and this you know very well, because as writers, we often have to engage with those people called editors. And editors are very clear right of, I mean, if there are editors in this room, I don't mean it. I think editors are the ones who make it possible for us to get these books published. But it is also the fact that, okay, so they have very clear views on what kind of language. So in fact, I've been telling my editor, I was very fortunate to have a very open editor, VK Karthika was a publisher of Westland. But I remember in following a prayer, I have so much notes on it. I told her I'll publish another book on just our discussion on what words and phrases are usable. How should the use of English in India work? And therefore, for me, the question of language was, why am I doing this with language? I'm not trying to just play with language just because I think it's great to play with language. I mean, although as a teenager I was very deeply influenced by James Joyce, I couldn't read Ulysses. I've still not been able to finish reading it. But it's like poetry. You want to read it, you give in to it because it just gives you a thrill. You don't understand anything of it. It's okay. There are writings. There is something about language. It's just about the resonance of the sound, the word. Something is happening around you, right? So to me, I was also responding to a larger question, and I don't know how much I should talk about this here, but let me say it. This larger question about what is the correct language of writing stories in India. Can I write stories set in real Kannada something locality in English? Okay, when I'm phrasing it that way, I'm responding to larger debates on this, right? Which I've had with many of my friends and so on. So that is the reason I asked the question, what is the mother tongue of a city? So when I write about a place like Matikere, Matikere's sounds, because remember the definition of language is nothing but sounds. There is no other definition. The origin of language is sound. And when I sit in Matikere, I listen to sounds of the road, of the cycle, of the motorbike, of Malayalam, of the Tamil, of Kannada. All these languages are resonating. Children are laughing and crying and so on. Now, I'm supposed to write a story about that. Why would I think that the only one language can capture it? Forget about English. Let's say I'm writing in Kannada. Why would I think Kannada can capture Matikere correctly? It's only people, a small group of this world of sound who speak in Kannada. The languages, the trees, the parks, the buildings don't speak in Kannada. But there is a great there is a commonality by which they live, all these languages. Because I said all languages are contiguous, they're connected to each other just of that sound. There's nothing called an English sound and a Kannada sound. Sound is sound. Right? So when I begin with that point, so how do I then write about this multiplicity of languages, people talking in different languages? And I mean, I thought I could do that in English, but it cannot be the English which is always acceptable to the editors. You know, and I often tell these editors, look, when the West Indian community in Britain wrote they completely mutated English and produced, a very different kind of writing, then people thought it was very creative. So in other words, what I'm asking is, what is our accent? What is our dialect of English that we bring through our engagement with our society? So that's why language becomes an important part, not as a very conscious attempt to do something with language, but as a conscious attempt to capture the world. It's a desperation to see, how can I say this? How can I capture it?
Right. Yeah. Actually, when you read the book, it does hit home that, this whole thing of water days, it's a loud affirmation of, that the city does not have a language really. It has its own language, but it's not the language what the people speak. And and I think you have stressed on the sensorial aspect, that all the words and whatever come out onto whatever words are heard on the streets and so on, that also forms part of the language. And I'd just like to read a little bit from Sundar's prelogue, as he calls it, just to give you all a sense of, the sensorial aspect of language. The language of the city is not another human language that we can speak. It may have a relation to it, but it is not that in its entirety. It rises in the way the rain falls on crooked tin sheets over uneven walls, in the sound of sliding slippers on slushy roads. It contains the whisper of light under street lamps in early morning vigils and the musky sound of breathing dogs under the haze of rainy days. It has the clatter of the vegetable carts, the crumpled sound of a bitten puff by hungry teeth. So that's the sensorial aspect that you've been talking about, right? Okay. So, Sundar, I'm staying here in this whole idea of language. Now, the language of our city initially, at least in the earlier years, was Kannada, right? And it's the state language as well. But, we don't hear much of Kannada these days. You hear a lot of other languages spoken in the city, wherever you go. So when you have, a lot of migrants into a city and you have multiple languages spoken, the local language sort of loses its identity, right? So you have sort of tackled that in your book. Could you speak a little about that, how, the local language just gets lost in this whole babble of multiple languages?
And I think, this question about this goes back to the origin of our state, of the country, right? When you produce states in India post independence based on language, linguistic states. And that already produces a very difficult question, because no state speaks in one language. The Kannada you speak in Mysore and Bangalore is so different from Malnad. It's so different from Bellary, Gulbarga. In fact, I was with some very well-known Kannada writers in Hegodu, and we had a performance from some North Karnataka troupe. And at the end of it, the person who was sitting next to me, who was also a Kannada writer, told me I didn't understand 50%. And it was a performance in Kannada. In other words, the belief that there is just some kind of a language, one language which captures some kind of homogeneity of a state, is itself completely flawed. And it has had a major impact on education. For example, I was part of one of the task force for the state education policy. The Karnataka government wants to replace NEP, and we put something on SAP. In one of our meetings, we were talking with a group of people and various stakeholders, small group of people, and this question came up about Kannada textbooks for government schools in Kannada. And there were representatives, not just from North Karnataka, there are people from this region, including Mysore, who said this Kannada in the textbook is not the Kannada of our people. Many of them were marginalized groups. There was a Dalit group. They said, our children don't speak like this. They don't get what you are saying in this so-called Kannada which you're using. So it is not just about Kannada, by the way. And I think the greatness of Bangalore, and I really think it's such a really, truly important point, that the greatness of Bangalore lies in its capacity to allow this multiplicity of people. Chennai will not allow this to happen. I don't think, definitely won't happen in Kerala. No, it even today it doesn't happen. It happens in Bangalore for a variety of reasons. People have come from different places, etc. But the point is, for example, when I was telling this to somebody who is from Karnataka, and that person said, what do you mean that, the local language is not being spoken? She said, anyway, our languages which are Konkani and Tulu, they are not spoken you don't see that as languages which is part of the local languages.
No.
Yeah. So what I'm trying to say is, this is true in every state, but what we have done, what is special to Bangalore is its capacity to have been very welcoming about it. The assertions today that you hear, these so-called auto drive, these so-called social media thing, or auto drivers are saying speak in Kannada and taxi drivers are saying speak in Kannada, is just an attempt to find, okay, if all that, what language will I speak? I'll give you a very classic instance, in other states, you go and learn their language. Here, I have had examples of Kannada speakers telling me, they said, oh, they say something in Tamil, and I ask him, how do you speak in Tamil? He says, being in Bangalore, I have to learn to speak Tamil. Why? Because they go to the market, they're all Tamilians.
Of course.
You have domestic servants in the house, the labor are all Tamilians. So you have to change your language to be able to talk to them.
Absolutely.
So this is, what this does is, it actually says something, I think something very important about the spirit of Kannada itself and the spirit of the people here who, now some of them feel like, oh my God, how has this happened? But really, and sometimes, I don't know, I won't, this is also taping, I don't want to confess in public, but sometimes I do feel, speak local language, guys. I go, okay, I'm you go to places where we always thought a very traditional Kannada thing. You have people make idli dosas. They're all speaking in Hindi now, man. It's good. I know, I don't think there's something wrong, as I said. But I'm saying at one level, you say, oh my God, how much this has become spread. I'm saying I can sympathize with this question about if identity has been based so much on language. What is happening to all the people who feel that their language has been lost? And is this way to recapture? That's a far more complex question, but I do think there is something primordial about one's relationship with that.
Interesting perspective, Sundar. We can debate about this whole language issue for a very long time, but we have to move on. So with the multiplicity of languages in a country like India, does language impact the authenticity of literature? Should stories in a certain milieu be written in the native language? You know, or does it make it less authentic if it's written in another language? That's another debate that's also going on.
Stanley, you're really getting me into trouble. I mean, these are questions people have been fighting about so much, and whatever I say can be misinterpreted, but I'll say it anyway.
No, just,
No,
just
what I'm
one
saying-
point is, this thing about translations, right? They
Yeah.
say where certain stories need to be
Hmm.
written in the local language. Do translations take away something?
Yeah.
I
Yeah,
just
yeah.
wanted to understand
Okay. Great. So first of all, I think the question that certain languages have a natural connection to a particular language, I think could be a problem, because stories are not existing independent of language in the world. They are not like things. At the most, let's say one could say, to go back to old philosophical question, this bottle is there independent of the language I used to describe it. It has an existence, it is there. And we use different languages to talk about it. Okay, maybe that's one way of looking at it. Stories, if you make the mistake of thinking, stories are also out there in the world and they have a reality of their own, and writers are only representing it using language to talk about it. That would be, I think, a problem. Rather, we have to acknowledge the fact that something is there in the world, something triggers various things, but it is your use of the language, the way you say the story, that produces the story. There is no story independent of the language that you use to talk about it. So if you write a story in Kannada, yes, it has a particular world it inhabits, but that's a different story than the story you write in English or in Tamil or in Malayalam. And that is not a problem of translation. And translation has been very close to my heart, and I think that I really engage with it, because my first book, which is called, which is Pratiti said, was called Translating the World Science and Language, was actually about understanding what is translation from a different context from scientific texts. But repeatedly it's been so. Last year, when I gave a talk at one of the at IIC in Delhi on a national conference on translators, I'm saying this because the keynote I gave there, Scroll carried that article, and that
Right.
article is called Touching the Untouched. And the point I was trying to make there is that the problem of gap which you talk about, right? Kannada, if I write in some way, when I translate it into English, there is always something missing and lacking. So I was trying to point out the gap which translators seem to be so obsessed about actually arises from language, not from translation. Language has a problem with the gap with the world it tries to present. There is a gap between the world, the reality which language is claiming to represent. Every statement, if I describe this room in language right now, in English or Kannada, any language, there is always going to be a gap between this state of affairs, this reality of the room, and the linguistic description.
Okay.
It is that gap which is carried over in translation. It is not a question of translation per se. So I would say that when you write a story in Kannada or in English or in Tamil, you're writing a different story. That's all. It brings with it certain kinds of different things and a different staging of that story.
Right. Okay. So I'll request you to read a little bit so that the audience get a sense of language.
Okay, this is the so-called prelogue, right? I mean, that too is another example of what I was trying to see, the inability of language to be able to do this. Because after I wrote the book and with all this, okay, I must also tell you that, I've been talking about Joyce and stuff. This book is nothing like that. I mean, Joyce is unreadable. It's very pleasurable for me to read, but it's very difficult to read. This is a simple story, right? You didn't find it difficult to read, right? Yeah. So I just want to make sure, in case you think, oh my God, this is all these experiments on language, it's not for me to read. I mean, it's a very readable book. Okay. But my editor was still like, oh, you're doing all these things, you're claiming all of this. Maybe you should write a note. Maybe you should write a note. So finally, I agreed to write a note. Okay. But she said, oh, maybe it's a preface. I said, it's not a preface. It is a prologue. I wrote it as a prologue. Why I called it a prologue? Because I think this is essential to the story. In a prologue, It's part of the story. It happens somewhere and then the story begins, right? For me, this question about the city is a character in my novel. Language is a character, just like there are other characters. So Bangalore itself is a character. So I said this is only a prologue. It cannot be a preface.
But you've called it prelogue.
Yeah, because that's the point, right? Because editor, I have to satisfy, and thankfully she felt she's okay to accommodate my thing. So she said preface, I said prologue. So then I said, okay, I'll think about it, and then I sent the final draft with the name prelogue. And then I didn't want to put prelogue without a hyphen after pre, because then you will say, oh my God, these people are printing mistakes. They don't even check proper editing. So we put a hyphen.
This was the first time that I came across something like prelogue.
It is the
I'm not sure. Has anyone come across prelogue?
No, you couldn't have. It is the first use.
First time, okay.
Okay, so no, but I'm saying the spirit of that is not the creation of a new word. It is to keep pointing to us. Don't get too comfortable thinking that language is there to do the job you want it to do. Oh, that's the point. Okay, so within that prelogue, very quickly, a city does not speak to us in the way humans do. We establish. Okay, this sounds like a essay-like thing, right? The novel is not like that. The novel is exactly like all stories, and I'm just a little bit worried if I read this. Everybody think, oh my God, this is an academic philosophy.
It's just a bit about the language.
Yeah, exactly. A city does not speak to us the way humans do. We establish a relationship with the place we live in. It changes our life and influences our moods. It is a place that holds our cherished as well as traumatic memories. Walking through old haunts is not to remember what was then, but to discover bits of ourselves scattered through the city. The geography of a city produces our histories. Our memories and emotions are sedimented on a park bench, a movie theater, a corner spot in the Darshini with a particular smell of masala dosa, and the fragrance of a coffee wafting along with the smell of sampige flowers on a busy, noisy road. Anybody who knows Malleshwaram would know the sampige. We even have a road called Sampige. These constitute the existential moments of a city when it comes alive just for us, so that we can be part of its beating heart. And for me, the point here is that, city makes us. And that's why for me, Bangalore is so important. I can think that I lived in city, I lived in Bangalore, I did all of it. I am because of what Bangalore allowed me to be. Right? And the last part, you want me to? The mother tongue of a city arises in the moments of its existential crisis. You can hear it if you pay attention to it. There are crises of existence that it shares in parts with its inhabitants. The anxiety of a city becomes the anxiety of its people. Our languages change, we stutter, produce new words, forget old ones. We hide in cafes, outside bakeries, inside pubs, with the hope that the noise around us will drown out what the city is trying to tell us.
Interesting.
So city is in that sense, a living sense of thing. And therefore I keep saying, I end by saying that, the city allowed me to tell its story. It allowed me for various reasons.
Right. Absolutely. Thank you. Sundar, you write in English, but your novels have voices in different languages. So is there a translation going on within you? How do you explain that?
No, this is a very interesting question, which I myself am not sure of. So all I can say is that, when I say I write, let me also say this. I think I write in Kannada. But it's in English script. The script is English.
Okay. The images...
No, I'm saying this book is actually a Kannada book. But the script is English. What I'm trying to say by that is to ask us to imagine the possibility. Let me give you another thing. When Following a Prayer was written, I think the only people who had problems with it are Kannadigas. Other than that, the first person who read it, one of my editors who read it in Delhi, she said, it sounds like I was reading a Bengali book. And a Tamil translator of my book, who translated into Tamil the novel, he said, this to me is a Tamil book. He didn't see it as an English book.
This was translated into Tamil?
The Following a Prayer.
Oh, the first one. Okay.
So that's been now in different languages, Telugu and
Yeah,
Hindi
okay,
also.
okay.
So when they did it, for them, even the Hindi translator, and these are people I don't know. So for example, the Hindi translator, someone in Calcutta wrote to me saying, I was so much struck by it. I felt like I was reading a Hindi novel and I want to convert it into Hindi. So I said, the point about that is it's not that I have some special capacity to do that. I don't think so. It is just that I did not let a conscious idea of English come in the way of letting these stories come alive. And that's why I come back to the point that what is language? How is this English? If the sound, so for example, some people would say, you cannot write in English in the strict English way. Which English way? The British English way? The school English way? If I talk about, I use the Kannada sounds and the words and the grammar to write a particular in an English script.
Indian English.
That Indian English becomes very big problem. Yeah, you're right. I'm saying a variation of that. And for me, it is about how does it function literally, not just spoken. So you're right. What has happened to the Indian English is, for example, is it tells about people's accents, how we speak, etc. Right? No, I'm talking about the Indian accent, if you like, or the language accent in the world. That just as I speak, let's say we speak English, sounds so different from, let's say, Britishers speaking,
Yeah.
right? That accent, that Indian English usages I do. What if I tell you that the sound of the motorbike in Bangalore has a different accent than the sound in UK or the US?
The sound of the water.
The motorbike.
Motorbike.
A water
okay.
falling. Okay,
Okay.
great. A dripping water falling. Tuck, 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 it goes. What if I tell you that accent of that sound, when I write about it here, is different from what you hear it in, let's say, if you're sitting in some other country? Sounds absurd, right? Little bit absurd.
Yeah.
No. So I've a lot of absurd things like that are there in this
Exactly.
book.
I'm yet to come to grips with all that is written there. So yeah. Have you read Banu Mushtaq's Heartland?
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So Deepa Bhasdi's translation has captured all the idioms, the cadences, and every little thing pretty well. That's what the reviews say. What's your take on that?
Yeah,
On the book?
I'll also talk about one of the interviews where Deepa Bhashti says that, one of the unique, what she felt was very fresh in her translation was the fact that she could, the translation allowed her to bring in certain sounds into writing, forming new kinds of words and phrases and so on in English. And that's my struggle all the time with writing, fiction writing, which is that I don't need translation to legitimize my experiments with English. That's my point. That, when Bhashti says, okay, I can form these kinds of words. And so did the jury of the Booker said, oh, it sounds new kinds of forms of phrases and words. Why should it be validated just because it's translated from Kannada? If she had sent that text and sent it to any of the publisher, including all the Brits and the Americans who wrote about it, none of them would have published that book. If she said this was an original English book. I don't get it. What is different if translation allows you to do some things to language which you by yourself cannot write? You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So to me, my point is, I'm writing translating. That's why when you said, do I write translated text? I'm saying I want to produce these sounds within English itself. And I don't want to, so maybe I translate from Kannada in my head. I don't know. Maybe I translate from Tamil, Kannada, whatever different languages that I know, Hindi. But I don't think I do it consciously in that sense. I think my writing is, a lot of it is driven by just a kind of immersion into language. And one way I like to say about this, it may sound very pretentious and wrong, but I really like to believe that it is language which drives my writing, not me. So I don't really have the hold on that. So what I don't do is, I don't interfere and say, oh, this is a wrong way of writing. That's all I do. I don't do.
Okay, that's an interesting perspective, and I'm sure we'll have some questions from there are translators sitting around here.
I should have
So
warned me before.
be prepared. Right. So I'm going to pull you away from the book a little bit, Sundar. Now let's talk a little about Bangalore itself. Today the city has become a metaphor for so many things, right? Positive and negative, and mostly negative. Ruin city, traffic city, and what have you, right? Um, and you've been witness to this transition because you, like me, has also lived, and grown up in Bangalore. So how do you look at this transition, and how do you see Bangalore, a few years hence?
Okay, so this is the problem with growing old. In the sense, we always have nostalgia and say, "Oh, it used to be so good." And we often say this Bangalore, in when I grew up in Malleshwaram, I went to school and college always in the cycle. I can't imagine going on that road. I was in St. Joseph's College in school, and then I'd go from Malleshwaram there, and we'd go via Kumara Park, climb up race course, and go. I mean, I can't imagine anybody, any kid, going on a cycle on those roads today. Forget about all the vehicles, the number of potholes and other kinds of impediments on the road have becomes too much in Bangalore today, right? So we do, I think when all of us who have gone past a particular time have a sense of nostalgia. And always my nostalgia is brought back to ground when I talk to all my younger relatives in my house. And the first thing all these kids will say is, that is your Bangalore. This is our Bangalore. This is what we live in. This is what is going to become nostalgia for them. In fact, 20 years from now, if you have wonderful roads and no traffic, they're going to feel very bad. After growing up in yeah, really, I'm telling you, because that question of what Bangalore for them is this is all the spirit of Bangalore now, and then you made it like Netherlands or something. Oh my God, what happened to Bangalore? So there's one part of nostalgia. Okay, I'm just granting that, because every time I say this, all these kids really attack me. So I'm just anticipating that. The second point, of course, is the fact that in terms of basic things like governance, we have completely failed, and that we all know well. And Prem is here; they all have worked on it extensively. It's a terrible,
complete lack of vision.
Complete lack of vision, governance, corruption. I mean, however I want to support it, how do I justify going through potholes? Not in major parts, in a place like Jayanagar and JP Nagar, which was supposed to be planned, bigger roads, proper roads, etc. I cannot come out of my house with 100 meters without hundreds of holes.
But we've all just coped with it silently.
Exactly. And that's the story in what it is.
Yeah.
That story of how that girl dies and what is it that caused it. That fact that none of us take agency to be able to say, look, if this is the person, what will I do with it, right? We have become silent. And what happens to Matikere, what happens to the people in that story? We're all nice people. Nobody is evil, nobody is great. And we're all caught in events, and we are just driven by the events. And to me, the most important aspect of it is the question of technology. Really, that is the background of this very silent co-option of all of us into going along a particular path without exhibiting our agency.
Right. Okay, we'll just move on. I just want to also ask you a little bit about your experience with publishers, because your style of writing is unique, given your emphasis on the sensorial, the sounds, the sense of a city, and all of that. And publishers generally like to play safe. So, what has been your experience, Sundar? Was it easy getting your books published, or you had to sort of cope with a lot of demands and changes or whatever?
Okay. Publishers. I have I don't have too many good things to say about publishing industry in India. Not because I have been writing for decades. I've written because while I was doing for me, philosophy is also, as I said, a form of expression. And when my first novel came out, when some of the people who knew I was working only in academics felt a bit let down. Why are you doing fiction if you're doing all this philosophy? So I told them, when I wrote stories about society or about science and language, you called it philosophy. And when I write philosophy, you call it fiction. For me, it is just a form of understanding and writing and exploring. Okay. So, publishers, my first part for various reasons. So, in the 90s, when I started writing, in fact, one of my most favorite books which is not published, which is too radical, I think, at some level, is called Paris, Madras, the first novel I wrote. I sent it to so many publishers. It's impossible to get publishers to respond. Even following a prayer. It happened during COVID, and I was, doing other kinds of things. I've been working with children for a long time. So when I wrote that story, because it really touched me very deeply, working with children in so many rural areas about these very basic questions, no publisher, they don't even respond. They don't even send you an acknowledgement. Okay. So I figure out, well, maybe I'm writing such real trash that, they don't want to respond. But then whenever I think that, I go and read some of the published books and say, my God, how did they publish these books? I'm sure all writers have this thing. How did they publish those books if they're not responding to my things, right? So it actually happened to a very fortuitous accident. After I wrote Following a Prayer, because it's about these 3 young girls, very close to my heart, and that kind of what happens with them in the story. I saw it as a very feminist text. I wanted a feminist publisher to publish it. I didn't know anybody, but I knew somebody, Rita Kothari was an Ashoka, who gave me the email address of Urvashi Butalia of Zuban, right? And when she told me about Urvashi Butalia Zuban, I said, oh, that's fantastic. I really want to be published by Zuban. Because it really stands for, feminist publishing in India, etc. So that was the first copy, etc. was sent to her. And then I forgot all about it. And then one day she wrote back saying, she had said, okay, send the manuscript. So I sent the whole manuscript to her. Then after many months, she wrote back, it really touched her. It was something, it was not for Urvashi. I don't think it would have got published. Yeah. But she said, I don't want to publish it in Zuban. Okay. She said some other bigger publisher should publish this because this is what. And it is through that, then Penguin got in touch. After all that, then Westland. And by then I went to Karthik. So the second book. And once you have one book, right. At least, one publisher will respond to you. At least that publisher, at least to reject it, at least you'll get a response to your email, Otherwise, I think I don't understand this whole logic and this decision and, what book is, is going to be published or not. I find it very difficult. And I realize when I talk to these publishers, they also say, there are so many manuscripts we get. How can we respond? I understand that. Okay. But I do think we need a...
Sure. Yeah. Before we just open up for Q&A, Sundar, briefly, you've been writing a lot about, you're doing a lot of academic writing, and now you've gone into fiction. Are you going to juggle both, or you're going to be in fiction for some time? And how has the transition been?
I don't know. My new book, which will come out maybe next year, it's all done. It's an introduction book on philosophy. It's called, one of the working titles is Philosophical Imagination, because it's an introduction to philosophical thinking, drawing from different traditions. So, but I really want, I think writing fiction for me is extremely... See, the point is, I think left to myself 10, 15 years back, I would have written a lot more fiction. But it was impossible, as I said, to get anybody to even respond to you. So I didn't write fiction because it was impossible to get published. Right. And now I know that at least you have access to people who will at least read your stuff before they reject it. That means that, for me, writing fiction is going to be a very important part of my engagement with it. Right.
You have been listening to BIC Talks by Bangalore International Centre. If you liked what you heard, do follow us on social media. Keep up with our programming by signing up for our mailer on the website, or leave us a review on Apple Podcast or iTunes. The crew that makes these podcasts possible is S. Sarvana Raj and Ranjit Kumar on sound supervision and production. Artwork is designed by Chandani Venkataraman of Crisscross Design Studio. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel on your favorite podcast platform. It can also be accessed on our website, bangaloreinternationalcentre.org. This is Sunaina Jain signing off on behalf of everyone at BIC.